I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Jason Athanowicz with Fries and Nichols, and then also Mr. John Ellis with Intera. They will be providing an overview of all of the elements of the Joint Regulatory Plan Review. So, Jason, welcome.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley, and thank you to the entire board, and thank you, Mr. Wine, for that introduction. We've been working with your staff and the committee for quite a while now, working through this, and it's been quite a pleasure to do that. This time around, we've had a lot more tools to work with than we ever have in the past. It's an exciting time to work on some of these challenges again, and we'll walk you through a little bit of how this process came together. You've seen some summary literature there that gives you an idea of all of this, but nothing works quite as well as just walking through the whole thing. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and start into that. And just as a refresher, this was a collaborative effort, not just with y'all and the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District as well. Though both districts worked on it, also included support from Texas Water Development Board in the development of the groundwater model, along with USGS in developing that groundwater model for the actual simulations that we'll be talking about today. And the way I like to describe this is breaking it down into 3 key steps that all come together into a 4th step here that allows us to really look at the future alternatives. That first one started with the development of population and water demand projections. So that is understanding the number of people that are coming into the county and how we expect that to change over time. Very similar to what's been done in the past. This study, different than studies in the past, is also now looking at the availability of alternative water supplies. So alternative water has always been critical for achieving the regulatory plan in the past. And this study asked that question of what is available and what can be made available in the future to make sure that that regulatory plan can continue. And then third, the development of the updated groundwater model, which would, for the first time, combine the aquifer drawdown and subsidence results all within one package, which gives us the ability to model this at a degree that has never been done before for y'all's purposes. And then finally, with all of those 3 tools, bring that together into the evaluation phase of looking at different regulatory scenarios, and that's what that'll be the meat of what we'll be talking about later on as we talk about these different questions and how they're answered. So starting with population demands and projections, as we pointed out, this drives literally everything in the simulations because the subsidence is driven by groundwater production is driven by water demand driven by population growth. And so to start this out, this process that we use this time really combined 2 different methodologies. And the reason for that is if you talk to a demographer about projections, they will want to give you either long-term projections for an extremely long period of time, or they will want to give you short-term, very hyper-local projections. Not the 2 of those. Achieving both of those things is incredibly difficult. And so that's why we've really combined 2 different methodologies here. One of them being a long-range, wide area model developed by the University of Houston called the Small Area Model Houston. And that projected population growth at the census tract level for the entire 10-county region that you see there. And they did that out to the year 2100. So going out very far into the future, giving us a lot of flexibility of how we might want to divide up scenarios. Now to kind of bring that down to an even more local focus, census tract is already pretty detailed for some of the stuff that we're talking about for the next 75 years or so. But to really get that local information from an outfit called Zonda was used to provide an idea of what's going on the ground over the next 10 years. And so this is really looking at near-term local, hyper-local development trends. And this wasn't used everywhere throughout the development, throughout the study area. That was really focused on in Harris County, Area 3, the northeastern portion of Harris County, a little bit of Waller County there, and of course, Fort Bend. With the amount of growth that y'all have, y'all were the #1 choice of where to focus this methodology. And so this is extremely important in getting a much higher level of spatial resolution down on the ground. This chart highlights the change in population projections, and you'll see across the board, these charts are going to be split. There's a break there, so just pay attention to that. You've got Harris County up there kind of blowing out the rest of the numbers on total population, but y'all are really the stars when it comes to the amount of population growth. And so, all in all, the projections for Fort Bend County this round compared to 10 years ago when we looked at the same process are very similar in a lot of ways. Where other counties kind of trailed off more, Fort Bend County has really continued that same trend and is getting to a point where you're looking at a population of about 1.5 million by 2050 and crossing the 2 million mark by around 2090 or so. So definitely the highest rate of growth sustained for the study. Another way of looking at this is comparing the projections this time to essentially what was done last time. So these two sets of numbers here, the green lines are all related to your study right here. The gray lines represent the regional water planning data, and just to give y'all an explanation of this, the regional water planning data was derived from what y'all did 10 years ago. Y'all are the only region in the entire state of Texas that has been able to convince the Water Development Board to use your projections and not theirs. And so that in itself is a pretty big accomplishment. But the key takeaway here is the trend in the change in those trends. Again, the green lines are what you're looking at now. They go out farther than the past projections. They do start to attenuate a little bit more, where the past projections just kind of carried out in the future. The new projections do take into account more factors. They take into account land use a lot more than we ever have before. They take into account more economic factors and start to change that trajectory over time. So projections largely ending up in about the same place, but taking a little bit longer to do it. The first several decades, though, are still going to be at a very high rate that y'all have seen up till now. And then looking at the forecast spatially, the dark colors here represent where you've got the highest rates of growth. And again, Fort Bend is right there on a percent change basis as you go tract by tract. And this is just looking out 2020 to 2050. As we've seen from the graphs before, that trend continues out beyond 2050 for sure for y'all. So if we did look at the longer range on that, you continue to see that sort of detail. And then translating that to a demand. Of course, the population only gets us so far. We have to know how much water use is associated with that. Again, break in the chart here, but you see that purple line there, second highest, represents the Fort Bend water demand and how that continues to grow over time. Now, this is only municipal, so just keep that in mind. We'll talk about non-municipal here in just a moment, but this represents where that population, we've applied per capita water use, that's unit water use per person, on a utility basis. And when I say that, I want to clarify that the study doesn't just look at a countywide aggregate, but goes utility by utility, calculates a per unit demand for that utility, and then applies that back to the population growth for that utility. So the intent here is to take data that we get for population at the census tract level, breaking that all the way down to census blocks, and then putting those blocks together into actual utility boundaries that y'all would be more familiar with. So cities, MUDs, and others, so that we can apply those per capita demands. And similarly, you've got a very highly detailed map here of projected municipal water demand. So those brighter colors, those are your higher demands, dark ones are your lower demands. And no surprise if you can see where that outline is there for Area A. The Fort Bend demand is largely concentrated there in Area A, and of course continuing out the 59 corridor with less demand in 2050 in Area B, but starting to have some growth out there. And so everything we've talked about there is focused on municipal, and that's really the big driver for growth for the county and really across the region. Did want to point out though that we have taken into account other non-municipal demands as well. A lot of this data coming from Texas Water Development Board and their projections, and looking at your own data on how that's split between groundwater and other water sources, and also utilizing y'all's data for agricultural use. As we went through this, we analyzed the different sources. Y'all were far and away the best source for irrigation, livestock, historical use within the subsidence districts. So we've used that in Harris and Galveston, and for y'all, we have taken that information and used that to map out the continued decline. As Mr. Lai was mentioning, we've had this turnover from an agricultural irrigation based economy and how that's continued to change over time. That's still occurring. And we have done some analysis there to attenuate that decline over time, where it levels out, never goes to zero, but it does level out a bit. Any questions on population and demand projections before we move on to alternative water supplies? All right, so as we talked about, the availability of alternative water supplies has been able to drive the regulatory plans thus far. So it's important for those sources to be available in the future. So as part of the study, a wide range of options was considered and investigated to see just what the potential is for the development of alternative water supplies within the region. And at the beginning, over 20 different options were thrown out there. And so it's hard to work with, so that was very quickly shortlisted down to a few to really focus the study on. One of those being the development of surface water. And so that, of course, today at this point has been the largest driver for alternative supplies. Seawater desalination, centralized reclaimed water treatment, and so we're talking about large reclaim facilities as opposed to the decentralized reclaimed water treatment. So those are more scalping operations, small facilities that are out in the system. Brackish groundwater desalination, aquifer storage and recovery, where water would be stored and injected under the ground and then recovered for use at a later time. And then demand management and conservation. And so each of these alternatives was examined, first just describing them, and so we are all on the same page of what those are, estimating what magnitude of supply might be available, preparing cost estimates for those projects, get a range of what implementation might be, also implementation timelines. Doesn't do you any good to have a cheap project if you can't get it done in time. And then also assessing the potential impact of climate change on those options. So, as I alluded to, what the study really got to was a range of costs, knowing that each project at different scales for different implementations are going to have a different range of costs. But what you see here are some trends that some options like seawater desal, some of the potable reclaimed sources, things like that, are higher than what we've seen traditionally for surface water. And so the whiskers on these plots are pretty wide just because of that uncertainty and where some of these projects might be implemented, but it gives you some relative magnitude of what a cost might be for these different sorts of projects.
So are these costs for the provider or they're for the end user?
These are the costs for the development of the project delivered. So how that integrates with the rest of the user's water portfolio and what the finished product is.
So this is just for the provider to get you the water from one of these things. Okay.
That's correct.
All right.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And so yeah, that would have to be translated with the actual provider's portfolio. So if they've got cheap alternatives to supplies they can blend that with, it certainly facilitates some of these more expensive ones.
Well, obviously, if it's going to cost me $4 a gallon, I got to sell it for more than $4 a gallon to recoup my cost.
Yeah, there'll be a lot to that. This is developed and provided to the utility, so you've got everything downstream from that that'll come with it. And so, as far as implementation timelines, some of these projects, again, seawater desal being one of the longest on this list. Some of the surface water projects can take a very long time to implement. So, where we see some advantages here are in some of the reuse projects. Some of them are very expensive, but some of them also do have shorter timelines. It's more controllable. There are more controllable elements there to get those projects implemented. And of course, demand management, we always like to lean on that. If you can use less water, it's the easiest water to get to in the end.
What's the dash? lines out past the?
That's just the range. So when they did this, they wanted to
Oh,
provide a
that's right,
range,
okay.
kind of like they did with the cost.
The low range is where the solid stops and the high range.
Exactly. So you might have a short range there, and it might go out to this. This is one of those studies that has an extremely high level of uncertainty because of how it's being implemented and how general it is. But it does give you an idea of the magnitude of what we're talking about.
But you took examples of real projects that took that long, or?
That's right.
Today's car,
I'm sorry.
today's car.
The dash line?
That was 2024.
That's that range.
Yeah.
And then getting that down to total amount of water, so adding up all these different options. One element in here that wasn't directly called out in those alternatives per se was the development of existing supplies that are already there. So if you look at water from a regional basis, going back to say the Region H plan, you have water that is still around, not fully perfected, that isn't deliverable today, but could be delivered. Some of that remaining water sitting in reservoirs, so there is some water there that can be implemented. That's where existing supplies come in to a large degree there. But adding all those different sources up, you're looking at something that's on the order of 1.9 billion gallons per day of water. So we're talking some pretty substantial supplies, and so the region is really benefits from a large amount of alternatives that we could potentially reach out to. So rather than just having to focus on a few different projects, there are a few different ways of achieving the regulatory plans that y'all work with.
Jason, go back one.
Sure.
On this, does this start before there's even an agreement between the wholesaler and where they find the source? That's where the day one starts, or is that after they are already under contract?
That's right. So all of and that in itself is its own lead time for sure. But this is mostly focused on the implementation of the infrastructure. This is planning, design.
So there could
permitting.
be another length, just to say 5 years to negotiate a.
You could easily spend that or much longer,
Yeah, much longer.
just trying to negotiate for the water, no doubt.
Okay.
That's why it's important to start those conversations early, and this is a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
forum for those
I
sorts of
think
conversations.
Mayor Owens down there started, 10 years before you actually got any surface water treated?
We paid a premium for 10 years to,
Like a couple $100,000 a year
yeah,
type of water?
$150,000 a year for 32 MGW.
We always like to say the engineering solutions are the easy ones. It's all the contracting and the politics that come with it. that make life
Those
miserable.
attorneys get involved in that.
So the bar on the far right that says potential 2070 supplies, is that to meet demand? Or is that just saying that's what the supply is? Is it?
That's what's available to meet potential demand.
So
So
that's-
the demand is of course going to be driven by how the regulatory plan's set up.
But I mean, you're saying,
Yeah, I mean-
but another way of saying, this is what you think the demand's gonna be, is it not right? Or-
No, this is what's available. So this is all just on the supply side. This
So is
doesn't
this-
take into account what amount of water might be needed.
Okay, so was this gonna be short of demand or greater than demand?
As it turns out, this is greater than, but we don't have a direct comparison.
Okay, that's fine.
That's right.
All right, thank you.
Jason, the blue bar represents surface water. Is that additional surface water that's available to be used, or?
That's right. So that's an additional development of surface water projects, as opposed to the existing supplies, which
Yeah.
are more water that's sitting there.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so, concluding that portion of the study, the assessment was that there is an adequate supply of water to meet the future demands from the regulatory areas. Still points toward surface water being a key driver for that alternative water supply, so we would anticipate those projects to continue to a great degree. Reclaimed also being an option for high potential. Already we see that in a lot of locations. I think that's only going to be a bigger piece of the pie in the future. And of course, some of these bigger ones, they need that lead time. They need those conversations. They need the regional support and backing. So that coordination is absolutely important to implement some of the things like seawater desal, the interbasin transfers, to transfer some of that surface water that is around. Any questions on alternative supplies?
Did we look at specific, areas like where, like the pipeline that comes up from, I believe, Brazos, Missouri County, to serve Richmond, Rosenberg? Did we look at specific projects like that could add another, I think there's another place to put a 36-inch line there.
This took a pretty high level view, so it didn't really get into
Didn't
detail.
get into minutia.
That's right. Yeah, this is just kind of looking for the order of magnitude of what we're talking about on alternative water. And if there are no questions there, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to John. He's got the exciting stuff coming up where we actually get to see where all this starts to come together on the tool, the groundwater model, and then evaluating the scenarios. So I'll let him take over from here.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Ellis with Intera, here to go over a bit about the modeling tools and the scenario results as a part of the regulatory plan review. So I want to talk briefly about the Gulf 2023 model first, and then from there I'm going to go into the Gulf versus the press discussion, comparing two different models and those results, and then from there I'll go into the scenario and what we saw from each of the four scenarios that were presented today. Right, so the Gulf 2023 model was used as a part of the regulatory plan update, and this is the newest in a line of groundwater models for, a long line I might add, of groundwater models for the northern Gulf Coast and the greater Houston area. It was released in January of 2023 and was certified as a GAM by the Texas Water Development Board the following year in February 2024 after they determined that it represented the best available science for the aquifer system. This model is calibrated to 115 years of land subsidence data from all the way back in 1906 to 2020. And there's a lot of updates from the previous model. There's a newer model code that it uses. It uses a new land subsidence package. It provides a more robust and updated simulation of land subsidence. It does have redone recharge, layering, hydrogeologic layering, water use, groundwater level targets, and it also looked at subsidence all over again from scratch, looking at how much has happened in the Houston area from 1906 all the way to 2021. So bottom line, completely new tool, and it has a lot of advantages from the previous tool. If you do want to look at the report that documents this model, there's a QR code there in the bottom right of the screen. So one of the items we wanted to look at is how subsidence in this new model, this new tool, compares to an existing tool that the districts have been using now since the 1970s, and that model is called the press code. Press code, again, these models have been around for a long time. They provide localized simulations of land subsidence at 26 sites across the greater Houston area. So again, this just gives you an idea of assessing what does this new tool do for you as far as the subsidence simulation compared to the existing tool that you've used for many years. Now I'm going to note here that we are comparing a 3D groundwater model versus a site-specific 1D compaction model, which is what the press models are. So there's very different tools in terms of the spatial scale, how much of the area that they're simulating, and the functioning of the code under the hood. Gulf 2023 simulates groundwater flow subsidence at a regional scale. It includes, again, the entire greater Houston area and the northern Texas Gulf Coast. The press sites are much smaller. They're on the order of about 7 square miles for most of those sites, the largest of which I think is about 20 square miles there inside Harris County. So again, the spatial scale very different here, but it is completely appropriate to look at these tools to again see what kind of subsidence are you getting from them. I mentioned that caveat just so you can keep that in mind when you're looking at the results between the two tools.
What's the square spot Arcola? Is that, how many miles is that? What's that?
The Arcola site should be about 7 square miles, I believe. Yes.
Does that have any semblance of why we're seeing that subsidence that Greg mentioned a while ago?
All that is that area, the size of that box you see there is just all that entire area encompasses all the groundwater levels they used and the benchmarks they used in GPS stations. So these were more closely clustered than if you look at, say, the Katy site, where that's a much bigger area because they had to combine all of that data to model a single site.
There's 3 blocks at the Katy one where there's that L shape.
Correct.
Is
They used all the data within that L shape.
There's 3 of them, so it'd be 7 by 7.
Correct.
What?
3
So
7
what,
by
is
7.
that's another one. Katy shows a lot of subsidence right now. Is there more detail in that area? So it shows it's more sensitive in that area? Or
For Katy, they just had to combine more data, which is why the box is bigger.
that's not the reason we have red dots up there.
It's good.
There's red dots on some of our annual reports that show.
There is a lot more. There is a good amount of data there, yes. There is quite a bit more than
There's
another.
semblance of that compared to what we're seeing is real subsidence. Because the annual model.
John, if I can just interject real quick.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, what we're looking at here are looking at models that
Right.
simulate groundwater flow and even predict groundwater flow and subsidence. But the red dots on our annual report map are actually measured data.
But I'm just saying, is there a correlation between the two?
I think the next slide's gonna show you.
Okay, maybe I'm jumping.
I'm going to show you the results of what that looks like in comparison. So I'll go ahead and move on to that next slide here. So this slide here, this shows you 3 sites in the Fort Bend area if you look at the models together and you look at those results. So the Press site is in the black, that's the black line. The Gulf model is in the dashed orange line. And what you're looking at here is subsidence through time. So if you look at the bottom of each of those charts, you'll see the year there, that's the x-axis. The y-axis there is the amount of subsidence in feet. This is at these point locations, these Press sites. So this shows you
So it's compared.
it's a comparison of the model performance for the Gulf model and for the Press model, that localized model at each of these Press sites.
So the red dots are the actual?
Good.
They're actual from Press sites?
The Press simulates pretty close to the actual. It's pretty close. I'm going to note, I mean, the subsidence measurements are from a variety of different techniques, but they've averaged them together to basically say this is representative subsidence at the site.
Yeah, so just to be clear, we're looking at the comparison of 2 different models. And the whole idea of this effort was to see if we needed to continue to operate and maintain the Press model, or if our new model would be able to provide us the same level of information that we had before.
We're kind of
So this is a model-to-model comparison. This is not actually measured information, this is simulated data.
Calibration.
But it's not from the monitoring sites.
This is not monitoring data, this is model.
Oh, okay.
results.
I'm going to note that in general, the Press model usually does a pretty good job of hitting your observed data. That data that you see from your PAM sites, from the old benchmarks, it does a pretty good job of actually simulating.
Okay.
So if you look at the,
And we get that data from our annual report, right? Our annual report.
that is included in the annual report. So if you just look at these sites just one by one, I won't spend a ton of time on these, but for instance, the Arcola site, you had a little bit of divergence there in the Gulf versus the Press simulated subsidence. Most of this was just due to the fact that the Gulf model didn't have any specific calibration data at that site prior to 2010 when there was a GPS station P040 installed at that site. Essentially that benchmark data, that old subsidence data was not available at the site. The Press model was calibrated to, the Gulf model was not. So that's a large difference in your results, is because of just the lack of data in the larger regional model that the Press model had. Okay, so that's essentially what you see at that site. At the Katy site, you see the lines kind of overlie each other. That means the results are very similar. At Katy, again, as you mentioned earlier, there is a lot of data at Katy, and for the Gulf model, we had that data and calibrated to essentially the exact same data, and we got most of the exact same results. Okay. So that was good to see that. If you look at Richmond Rosenberg, I mean, for the most part, it's similar. Again, similar to that Arcola site, we didn't have a whole lot of long-term benchmark data for calibration of that site in the big regional model compared to the local model, the press model, that did have that data. So again, that was largely accounting for most of what you see is the difference between the two models.
John, before you move on, the black line, the slope of the black line, does that measure the rate of subsidence?
That's correct. So if you look at Richmond Rosenberg, that press model really starts to show a lot of subsidence in the later period. You can see that. You can see that right there.
But compared to the Arcola area,
It's
I assume these are all the same.
yes, these are the same scale.
Same
So
verticals and everything.
yeah, so Arcola it simulates.
Compare that aggressive slope compared to what is almost flat. I mean, it's
Right.
not flat, but relatively less.
Sure.
So,
And I would note with that, I mean, this is a lot of subsidence there in Arcola. The press is simulating that has not been seen historically at any point. These are again based on projections. But I mean, Gulf model projects quite a bit less per foot of groundwater level decline versus what you see there in Arcola. So
it's even more than the rate shown for even the Katy area.
that's correct.
What is that acronym up there? It says subs for the red dot.
That's the Gulf model.
Is that the Gulf
That's
model? Is that just an acronym? Tom?
Yeah, it's issue. Correct. Yeah. Subsidence for Gulf.
Okay.
So as you look at these results, you know, there is a difference between these two models and the assumptions and the code under the hood of these. In general, you see pretty good agreement between the models historically. Of course, when you get in the predictive period, you do see some differences in the projected subsidence.
John, would you remind me that the scenario that was used for the Gulf model was the baseline scenario for this comparison?
That is, this is the baseline. That's correct.
So when we're talking about this in a minute, but the baseline scenario is the current regulatory plan of the district, the current regulatory plan of Harris Galveston, and the expected regulatory management practices that was around us, correct?
So
I
what
will-
line is the baseline?
Go ahead, John.
I will note that there was some slight modifications to what you see on these slides. It took the average of the last 3 years and ran that forward though, versus the baseline uses different assumptions. So there are some differences to what you see here. I'm gonna show you the baseline scenario results here in just a second, so you will get to see that.
So did you say that all the assumptions were not the same between both models?
It's based largely, the difference is largely under the hood, the way that the models function, the code.
Yeah.
And then also what the models were calibrated to. They weren't always calibrated to the same subsidence or water level data from certain wells. That's one of the differences. The press model, they used in some sites here, they used as many as 8 or 9 different wells in different aquifers to average a water level through time to calibrate to. Gulf may have used different.
Got it.
So a lot of it is in the assumptions used and the data used to calibrate. I'll show you 2 other sites here, and then we'll move on to look at the scenario results. So I've got Needville and Smithers Lake on here, and you can see the map locations 2 slides above this. You can actually see where these sites are at on this slide if you're not sure where those are. Here we're going to look at Needville there in the southern part of the county, and then Smithers Lake in the southeastern part. So if you look at these 2, overall the results fairly similar. The Gulf model at Needville does tend to simulate a bit more subsidence than what you see at the press model. The press subsidence rate, though, of subsidence in the future period, that black line, though, is a bit greater. So there's just, again, some differences between the larger regional model and what you see from the localized model. There is also a GPS station there at Needville, P031, and the Gulf model did simulate the subsidence pretty well from what we get at that GPS station. So they did provide a bit of confidence in the results. There are some differences though. Yeah. And if you look at the last site there, the Smithers Lake site, it's also a similar story. Gulf didn't really have a whole lot of long-term data to calibrate to, just a nearby GPS station, which is P058. Again, in the model, it was simulated pretty well, just later data compared to what you saw in the press model, which is calibrated to a longer period of data. So again, overall, decent fit to the observed data. Again, realizing that with Gulf, a good bit of the subsidence we simulated was based on your network of GPS stations. All right, any questions on the Gulf versus the press simulated subsidence? Okay, so at this point, we're going to move into the scenario results. So as Jason mentioned before, we use the groundwater model to run a variety of scenarios to look at the occurrence and the location of subsidence based on changes in groundwater demand. Those changes in groundwater demand are based on the changes in the population projections. So today we'll discuss the results of 4 scenarios. You can see those there on the screen. From left, you have the baseline scenario, the Area B 2050 conversion scenario, the no new conversions, and the Fort Bend delay to 2030 conversion scenarios. So let's walk through those briefly and then we'll look at the results. The baseline scenario there on the left of the screen, that scenario largely answers the question, what kind of subsidence do you expect to occur if the existing regulatory plan is maintained? Okay. So it assumes that the current active water management strategies that are employed here in Fort Bend by the water providers within the district are continued. And it also assumes that the conversions built into to Harris County in their current regulatory plan, those also do successfully occur. Okay. So the baseline scenario assumes a constant per capita demand for each municipal domestic water use over the planning horizon, and that does assume pretty typical climate conditions into the future. So essentially the changes in groundwater demand in time in this baseline scenario are driven by long-term growth in population and by the 2027 deadline for the Area A conversion. Okay. Then if you look at that second item on the screen from the left, that's the Area B 2050 conversion. And this just answers the question, what subsidence do we expect to occur if a new requirement was implemented to convert to 60% groundwater in Area B beginning in 2050? Okay, so it just tests a change beginning in 2050. So we're going to show those results for the period of 2050 to 2100 on that slide. And then the third one you see here on the slide, the no new conversions scenario. So that answers the question, what kind of subsidence would we expect to occur if the 2027 alternative water supply conversion is not implemented? The last scenario here is the Fort Bend conversion to 2030. It just answers the question, what happens if you delay the Area A conversion for 3 years? Okay. So we're going to go ahead and step through the results on these. And we're going to look first at the baseline scenario and the results from 2025 to 2050. So as Greg Wine mentioned earlier, kind of as an intro to what you see on these slides, you see a map here with projected subsidence in Fort Bend County for the period of 2025 to 2050. You see contour lines on the slide, those are in the black. These are contour lines of subsidence. So for example, if you see this area right here where it says 0.5, every part of this area within this 0.5 foot contour line has subsidence greater than 0.5 feet. Okay? Any area outside of this 0.5 foot contour over here, this is an area between where you have between 0.25 feet of subsidence and 0.5 feet. Any questions on the setup of these slides? Okay, just want to make sure that's clear what you're looking at when you're looking at these results. So again, this subsidence is between 2025, 2050, and overall for most of Fort Bend County, the subsidence is less than 0.5 feet here. You see between 0.25 and 0.5 feet for Fort Bend County. Over here in the Arcola area, you do see more than half a foot of subsidence up through 2050, and if you look at the actual values from the model and the individual cells here, you can see as much as about 0.7 of a foot of subsidence.
John, our next conversion is 2027, does that include?
This does include the 2027 conversion, that is correct. This assumes the current regulatory plan is maintained.
Current as exists.
That's correct. So again, you see here between half a foot, a quarter to half a foot through Fort Bend County, more than half a foot there in the Arcola area, which of course, again, as Greg mentioned, is in a GRP, but it is projected to have, again, greater than half a foot of subsidence over the next 25 years within the baseline plan. Any questions on the 2025 to 2050 subsidence? Okay, we're gonna move on to the time period 2050 to 2100, again, still looking at this baseline scenario. So I do want to preface these results just by mentioning that as you model periods of time farther out from the present, there is increased uncertainty in the results because you're going farther out in time, and those assumptions get a little bit fuzzier as you're looking 50, 70, 80 years into the future. So just bear in mind when you're looking at those results. When you look at the results for the 2050-2100 period, you see everywhere in Fort Bend, other than an area in the far northwestern part of the county, is within a 1 foot subsidence contour, which means it has 1 foot or greater of subsidence. If you look at the southern part of the county over here, southern and southeastern part, you're seeing about 1.5 feet or more of subsidence there in that axis between Sienna over to here, and then moving over to Needville area, and then all the way up to Richmond and Rosenberg. Again, all of that is within a 1.5 foot subsidence contour. If you look through the rest of the county, again, you're seeing generally at least a foot in most areas, more than 1.5 feet in the southern part of the county. I'm going to note then, just to make clear, this is the results for 2050 to 2100, not inclusive of what you saw on the previous slide from 2025 to 2050. Yes.
And just to be clear, there's not a contour line, but there appears to be some shading, and that represents.
Yes, that is a 1/4 foot contour of what you see right there. So this is 1.25 feet, what you see right there. Correct. So any questions on this baseline scenario that again continues your current regulatory plan through 2100?
This is just the subsides, period from 2050
Correct.
to 2100.
Correct.
So you have to add them together to get a.
So I did that for you, and if you look at the current map right here, where you see that shaded area of about 1.5 feet of subsidence from
right
2050, 2100, you're seeing about 2 to 2.5 feet in that area. If you look at 2025 all the way to 2100.
Okay.
That's correct. Outside of that area, you see less than 2 feet.
So that's additive.
That is additive. That is correct. All right, any other questions for the baseline scenario? All right, so I think we're ready to move on to the next scenario here, which is the Area B conversion scenario in 2050. That conversion right now, of course, is not in your regulatory plan, but this is just a question answering what if. What if you had a conversion to alternative water supplies in 2050 in Area B? Area B here is shaded on the map in the outline. You can see right here, this is Area B. And what I've done here is I'm showing you the baseline scenario results that you just saw in this map, the 2050-2100 map. You are seeing that on the left side of the screen right here. The scenario results from this scenario are on the right side of the screen, so you can compare and contrast the baseline with the regulation, including that 2050 conversion. I do start these results of this scenario in 2050 because conversion happens in 2050, so there's not going to be any change prior to 2050.
So the conversion would be to 60% groundwater?
Correct. Starting in 2050.
In 2050.
Yes, again, for Area B, assuming the other conversion in 2027 happens for Area A.
That continues on.
It continues on, that's correct. So overall, if you look at that, I mean, you see that the area here of greater subsidence that I mentioned in that last slide, it does decrease quite a bit. So you do see the success of converting Area B over here. You do see where the subsidence from the baseline to the converted area, you do see less subsidence, which is what you would expect and want to see if you do a conversion. So you do see less, and that does show that that conversion does reduce the subsidence. And then additionally, in the northwestern part of the county here, where you see this contour line, it moves inward a little bit. So you do see a little bit less subsidence also in the northwestern part of the county. Again, this is based on doing that conversion in 2050 for Area B. All right, any questions on this scenario? Any of the results?
John, just to make sure I'm clear, so in Area B, from that 2050 to 2100 is basically the benefit of the conversion in Area B gives you that 1 1/4 to a 1.
Correct.
foot
That is correct.
reduction in subsidence in area around.
And a lot of that is because a lot of the projected growth is expected in
In
Area
Area
B.
B.
And that's why you see the difference.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to the third scenario, which is the no new conversion scenario. So essentially, this takes off the table any of the conversions in Fort Bend County to include the 2027 conversion in Area A. So you do see, essentially looking at the baseline results over here for 2025 to 2050, if you look at the same time period for 2025, 2050 for the no new conversions, you see there is a greater amount of subsidence here in the middle to southern part of the county. Essentially, all of the county now under the no new conversions scenario is greater than half a foot of subsidence versus the baseline scenario, only this Arcola area has greater than half a foot. Okay, so essentially the whole county is covered by that half foot contour interval, but within the center part of the county, it expands now to 3/4 of a foot, and in the Arcola area, it actually goes up to 1 feet, just over 1 foot. So again, this does show you that these conversions and what you see from your regulatory plan, these are reducing expected subsidence, projected subsidence, and you can see that in results from the baseline with your current regulatory plan versus no new conversions. You just take those off the table, you do see a difference in the results, which you would expect to see.
Go back to the Area B regulation 2050-2100. What's that line that doesn't have a number on it down here? On the lower,
This one right here?
The line, yeah, that line, not that one, but that one up. Is there actually a?
This one right here?
Is there a number on it?
That is a 1 foot
Oh, is that
contour.
one? Okay.
That is a 1 foot contour.
Thank you.
All right,
John, just for clarification, when you say no new conversion, the assumption is that those entities that have over-converted continues to maintain their current.
That is
rate of
correct, but
process
they will
rate.
not undergo any new conversions.
Right.
That's correct.
John, can you go back, because I want to point something out. We've been talking about a half a foot, that's in 25 years, these are 50-year periods. So actually the one contour correlates to the half a foot over 25 years.
That's correct.
So,
That's correct.
thank you.
Okay, any questions on the no new conversion scenario results?
Why did you take these 2025 to 2050 out to 2100?
For these, we focused a little bit more on just the more recent period here, just to show what would happen when you didn't have that 2027 conversion in our. We do have the results though. Of the
Yeah, I thought we looked at that.
We do have those, yes, and we actually presented those last fall as well.
Yeah, I remember that.
Or the year before.
Or the year before. It's getting a little blurry.
12 months ago.
What he's alluding to is there are a lot of scenarios that were looked at, adjusted, questioned, redone. So there's been a lot of work done on that. Thanks, Lee.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions on the no new conversion scenario? Okay. Now the last one I'm going to show you is the delay conversion scenario. So all this does is it takes the Fort Bend Area A conversion that is scheduled for 2027 and just moves it 3 years to 2030. So these results overall pretty similar. It's what you would generally expect to see if you move this scenario, a conversion, an alternate water supply conversion, just 3 years. So for Fort Bend, essentially, you can see the Arcola area expands a little bit in terms of that half foot contour. And then over here in the Needville area, you do get into the half foot contour versus before in the baseline you did not. Okay. Now I'm going to note that that looks like a whole lot more subsidence over there in that Needville area. It's where you see this contour. It's not actually a whole lot more. If you look at the data itself extracted from the model, it's actually only about 0.5 feet, a 20th of a foot difference. I do want to make that clear. What was happening is before there's a contour line, it's just below the contour line in the baseline, and now it peaks just over it. So I do want to make that clear. We're talking about a 20th of a foot of difference here, so effectively. And I'm also going to note that, as Greg mentioned, we ran a number of scenarios conversions. We did a 2030 conversion delay, we did a 2035 conversion delay, we did a 2040 conversion delay. I'm showing 2030 just so you can see the difference. If you look at the 2035 delay results, you see about 1/10 of a foot as a comparison compared to this one.
But what that showed is that every delay did increase the subsidence.
That is correct.
But
So
we've delayed.
To be expected.
We've delayed it for 2 years, which is the last one we did, but really that's inconsequential. I mean, you'll check it every year for the annual report, so you're gonna have a backstop to look at it.
all right, is there any questions on the delay conversion scenario? Okay.
Well, I got a question. Is there anything in the annual reports for the last, I think it's like 10 years, that you gathered that might be beneficial to this, to y'all stuff?
I would note that in general, based on those annual reports, one of the kind of success points here is just how dense and how well positioned the Subsidence network is in here in Fort Bend County. Y'all have a number of stations that were used, and this model used every bit of that additional data that you didn't have maybe 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago. So the growth of your monitoring network has been very beneficial when you're looking at subsidence. You can't predict what you can't measure. And you need to have those measurements and that data in order to do these models. Otherwise, your model's not going to be worth much.
Where's the little light in the area B, aren't we, Mark? Here, in area B, a little light on
Because
it.
there's not development out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, but I mean, we need some more monitoring points.
Sure.
So did any part of the study consider enhancing the modeling, to, I guess, utilize more measuring points?
So in the modeling, we used any station that had more than 5 years of data. Now, since that point, there are another 3 more stations that have passed that 5-year mark. But if we started the model today, it would have included that data. We did 5 years just to get average trends versus a station just with a year of data to try to get an idea of, are we happy with what we're seeing out of these stations? So effectively, as your monitoring network continues to grow and expand, that data continues to get used, and it helps out these simulations, looking at your regulatory plan.
Only if it's 5 years of grade.
That's what we used. That's not necessarily what you have to use. That's just a cutoff that I implemented when we did the model.
Any particular rationale why it was 5 versus 2 or 3?
It wasn't. There was no one statistical element. Just to note that I'm happy with 5 years of data at a single site. When I'm seeing 3 years, generally happy with as well. But I chose to be a bit conservative with that.
Okay.
Well, John, also, if you look at how it moves in terms of you have a dry year or a wet year,
Right.
you might, because it's very sensitive, and that's why a 5-year period would kind of flatten that out.
I agree. Absolutely. All right. Any questions at this point on any of the scenario, any of the 4 scenarios that I've presented? Okay. At this point, then, I'm going to turn it over to Jason for a wrap up here. So, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, John.
I only have 30 more slides. This is honestly the last slide. So y'all have what
We
y'all
only have
been
one
looking-
in ours.
I know. Well, those were the secret ones. I was going to throw those out later. No, what you've been seeing is what's getting to this slide right here, and seeing the results that are coming out of the simulations, and what's been kind of summarized up from the committee on where are the focus areas. Having this information in front of y'all, and that's kind of focused on a few of these elements here. The first couple of findings that you'll see in there are really around this investigation of subsidence in Central Fort Bend County. And so some of this is what we're looking at, what you see there, and that artifact that's over there around the Arcola area, things like that, about the distribution of how conversion's done, and so forth. The second one for future study really digs into that Area B question. Y'all saw some scenarios there. Then again, that was focused, the reason we focused on that one out 2050 to 2100, because if you don't change anything until 2050, nothing changes in the simulations. But you did see that contrast there in subsidence results 2050 to 2100 when you did start to look at dialing back some of that use out there in Area B. So that's something else for the board overall to take a look at. And then central to all of this, it's come up the whole way through, is looking at y'all's subsidence monitoring program, continuing to expand that. Because everything that comes out of that ultimately goes into these models one way or another. So when y'all are looking at this 10, 20, 30 years down the road, everything that you're collecting is providing a resource for the next iterations of this. So those, just a quick summary of some of the takeaways from this. And of course, if there's anything along the way for any of us, y'all want to talk through, be happy to do it.